quick update and reflections on the multi-phase collaborative research?
Sure, absolutely. So I think many people on this call have heard me over the last year talking about this, but for the new people, I'm going to do a very, very quick recap. So we began this research in February last year with the purpose of gathering, analyzing, and distilling conclusions and guidance based on CLD efforts of global development actors. But basically, we said that we have 70 movement partners. Let's look at the work that we've been doing and see what does it tell us about the impact of community-led development. So after extensive consultations with monitoring, evaluation, research, learning, and program professionals from a lot of movement members, we honed down to 3 research questions that you see on the screen. Where has community-led development worked, how and why? And consequently also, where has it not worked and why? What has been the impact of community-led development programming? And finally, something that I heard constantly from different partners, how do we adapt existing evaluation methods to capture the complexity of community-led development and its impact? Because our current methods are really not helping us to do that. So if we can go to the next slide, John.
Oops.
Yeah. So we reached out 35 monitoring, evaluation, research, learning, and program professionals from 23 different organizations. Some of who I see on the call actually have been part of the research team and have been working on this over the last year. We have an advisory group of practitioner and academic experts, people like Scott Guggenheim, who John calls the Mike Jagger of CLD, but also academics from Charles Darwin University, New York University, Monterey University, and others. And we built this research on the principles of community-led development. So the 35 people that I talked about organized into 3 subgroups, each of which were dealing with this particular question that was integral to the research. So what do we mean by community-led development? Because we did not give organizations a definition. We said, send us reports for programs that you believe are community-led. What does community-led development actually do? It somehow seemed to believe that it does everything under the sun, moon, and stars. But what is reasonable to expect from community-led development? And finally, how do we capture the impact of community-led development? So those were the 3 tasks of the group that you see on the slide. Next slide, please, John. So the groups met over the summer and fall last year. And after multiple weekly consultations, lots of discussion and work, they came up with 3 tools that we shared in November last year. Starting with the movement, but also at the American Evaluation Forum, the Global Partnership for Social Accountability at the World Bank, Evaluation India, and others. The first was a CLD self-assessment tool. So the scoping group began by identifying 11 characteristics of community-led development. But like I said, this is a group of practitioners. So they wanted to see how these characteristics translate into the life cycle of a program. And that became the CLD self-assessment tool that we used for the research, and I'll be sharing some of what emerged from there in the subsequent slides, but also something that we hope organizations can use to see where are they in the journey of community-led development, what more can they do based on their own context and circumstances. And I already know at least one movement member that has said that they have applied and used this tool to examine their programming. The impact group looked at the impact over medium, short, medium, and long term. So from the sustainability perspective, and came up with an impact table. And the evaluation group came up with a set of 13 questions, which are important to ensure that evaluations are good quality evaluation, irrespective of the methods they use or the time at which the evaluations are conducted. All of these 3 are available. We've shared them with the movement for feedback. We are revising them, but if you haven't received them and are interested, please feel free to. Next slide, please, John. So, as I said, we asked organizations to submit reports for self-declared CLD programs. We received 419 evaluation reports, and after removing baselines and others, we came down to 284 reports from 67 countries. Before I go on, I have tried very hard to avoid jargon, but if there are terms that I use which are not familiar, my apologies. Please put them in the chat. It means I have failed in removing jargon from this presentation, and I will explain those terms. So, 284 reports from 67 countries. from 31 MCLD partners and hundreds of local civil society organizations that they have partnered with. Now, you can't see it very well on the graphic, but a bulk of these reports, so 58% or 185 reports are from Africa, 101 are from Asia, 24 from Central and South America, 1 from Papua New Guinea in Oceania, and 7 from Europe. And most reports are from Ethiopia, actually, 26 reports, followed by Uganda, Malawi, and Bangladesh. So in terms of timing of the report evaluations, when the evaluations were done, almost 50% of the evaluations were carried out either towards the end of the program or just as the program had ended. 12% were ex-post evaluations, which means that they were done 2 years or more after the program ended and tried to look at the sustainability dimension. And as you can see from there, for 31% of these reports, we either didn't know the evaluation year, the programming years, or at what point it was done. So we don't know the timing. Next slide, please. So the basics. For 256 out of these 284 reports where we had the information on where they were done, 191 were in rural areas and 59 in urban areas. Now, keep in mind that some programs were in both rural and urban areas, and there were some programs that were advocacy related or conducted in refugee camps, so don't fall into this criteria. The average duration of the programs was 4.88 years. Again, the caveat here is that this is the average duration for the program for whose evaluation report was submitted. But in many of these cases, the organizations had already been working in those areas previously through different programs and grants. In this current subset, World Vision and the Hunger Project had the longest running programs, and most of the programs that were long-term programming were privately funded. What that means is that the money did not come from a single grant, which was by a multilateral, bilateral, or a foundation, but came through other means like child sponsorship or investors or online fundraising or shops, so different means of programs. Now, if you look at the average duration of programs, and 164 programs were 1 to 5 years, 30 programs were for more than 10 years, 39 were from 6 to 10 years. So we do have a lot of long-term programming. However, 27 programs were less than a year. Not surprisingly, these were for humanitarian or emergency programming, but also livelihood programs tended to be normally short-term programming. If you look at who's funding these programs, we didn't have that information for almost 100 of the reports or programs. But mostly, 71% were privately funded, and USAID was the single biggest bilateral or multilateral donor with 39 programs in this. Surprisingly, foundations or funding different funds had only funded 24 programs in the study. John, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I mentioned the 11 characteristics of CLD that the scoping group had identified. Now, before I go on, the caveat here is that what you see in this and the subsequent slides are based on my observations as lead researcher when I applied the CLD rubric or the tool to all the reports that were sent to us. They do not reflect the opinion of the scoping group whose work was used to conduct this work. So you see there were the 11 characteristics of CLD, including participation and voice, inclusion, community assets, capacity development, collective action and planning, community leadership, accountability, and the others. Not surprisingly, inclusion and participation were the most visible in the reports. However, the inclusion, they were often limited to specific groups that were the focus of the programming. So it wasn't being overall inclusive with all groups, but it was including women or including youth or including people with disabilities or at times 2 or 3 groups. Also, inclusion and participation were normally in the context of service delivery or participation in meeting, but seldom reflected as a voice in decision-making processes. Facilitation was one common characteristic in all these programs, and it was important for enabling a number of CLD characteristics from collective action to participation. So it was mentioned in 57% of the reports, and 96% of the reports had some kind of training in it. Though, of course, it could include technical training or training for own staff on conducting the program. Now, one would imagine that community-led development is all about community leadership. And 65% of the reports actually have the term local leadership, community leadership, or village leaders in them. But it is always in the context of consulting them for evaluations. Very few reports talk about building community leadership or having community leadership in decision-making positions for the programming. Finally, what's been missing? Well, the factors that featured in very few reports were accountability. Often the only mention of accountability was about complaints, mechanisms for communities to get to NGOs and say this is not working well, but seldom was there a feedback loop that was completed, that is organizations going back and telling communities what did they do with their feedback or how they changed programming, or community leaders or facilitators being accountable to community members. Adaptability, missing. Collective action and planning, community assets and capabilities. Very few reports actually had these characteristics reflected in them. Now, sustainability is mentioned in what's missing, but if we go to the next slide, it has an interesting story. So after looking at all of these reports and going through them, I also wanted to quickly do a word search and see that if we did a very simple word search on the characteristics of CLD, by having a list of terms for each of these characteristics, then what would happen? And would this be reflected in terms of how the characteristics actually appear? So again, some trends are common, like inclusion and participation is definitely there. Community leadership, as I mentioned, there, but not in the context of strengthening community leadership. Sustainability, 80% of the reports actually mention the term sustainability, but it's often as a goal. Very few reports actually talk about exit strategies or how is sustainability woven into program planning, or what role that communities have in sustainability and in exit planning. So next slide, please. So some key things that emerge. I think the most important thing is to remember that what we talked about is the presence or absence of these characteristics of community-led development in the evaluation reports. They should not be conflated with what is happening on the ground. It could simply be that these things are happening and they are not being reported. The important thing is to find out what is happening. Are they not being done or are they not being reported? The second thing is that whose definition of community-led development is it? It was, like I mentioned, a very diverse group of organizations who came together in the scoping group to create this tool and definitions. But we are very cognizant of the fact that most of them, they were all INGO members. And we're going to be addressing this, and I'll come to that in the next slide. The big dilemma that this has posed for us in the research is that when you read these evaluation reports, as I was just telling Danny before we started the call, there is very little in there that tells you that this is a community-led program. So in other words, it seems no different from an evaluation for a normal education or a normal health program. Then how do we know that the impact that we see is because of community-led development, that this happened because communities were front and center in the program? If we don't know what characteristics of CLD were implemented, and this has again had implications for how we are going forward with the research now. The purpose of evaluations. Most evaluations said that their purpose was learning. Actually, if you look at the way they were conducted, it seems that their real purpose was accountability to donors and very little learning, because there was very little inferences on what this meant for programs going forward in terms of how programs should be reviewed or changed. And what this really means is that we really need to strengthen and talk about how we do our evaluations, be it the quality of evaluations, be it the intent of evaluations, or be it the content of evaluations. And this requires work not just with us as implementing organizations, but with the donors, because they are the ones who often commission these evaluation reports. Final slide, please. So what is happening next? Well, like I said, that all of this data is being used to construct the landscape of CLD programming, which essentially means like, what are organizations doing when they say they're doing community-led development? The scoping group is currently analyzing the data on all of those 284 reports that have been reviewed with the tool. And after checking for inter-rater reliability against professionals and trained interns, we will have this ready for everyone. The self-assessment tool has been now revised with feedback and is going to be available with guidance. So if you want to see how community-led a particular program is that you are implementing and what more can you do with those programs, this is the tool to be used. We're going to be conducting sense-making workshops with national chapters because, as we said, we are very cognizant of the fact that the team that developed these tools was primarily INGO professionals. So we want to make sure, is our definition of CLD how organizations at the national level and in communities understand community-led development. Finally, as I said, what the content of the reports has had serious implications in terms of how we go forward with the research. And we realized that what we need to do is a realist review. And this realist review would help us. So realist review is an approach where you don't look at does something work, but rather you try and understand how and why do things work. What are the processes and the mechanisms that are taking place in a particular context that give us certain impacts? And this realist review is going to focus on facilitation and community leadership to begin with, thanks to World Vision, which has sponsored the training. The team is already being trained on realist reviews by a world-renowned expert in this. It's a 1-month intensive training that is currently underway. And finally, as we said, a lot of the evaluations, and as you saw from the previous graphs, don't even have basic information that evaluations or any program document should have. So the quality appraisal tool, along with guidance on how to use it for CLD programs, is going to be available as well. If you have any more questions on this, feel free to write to me. If you want to be more involved with the research, if you want access to any of the tools, the reports, please feel free to get in touch. I will put my email ID in the chat box. Thank you.